They say Athens was a city of reason, of order, of clarity, of thought. But in the middle of its stone streets, one could often hear something deeply unreasonable. The shrill, fiery voice of a woman named Xanthippe. She wasn't just shouting. She was hurling insults, accusations, dishes, sometimes all at once, and standing silently, as if made of marble, was her husband, Socrates, the greatest mind of his time, the man who changed how humans think forever. And yet, here he was, enduring, unmoving, silent. People watched, laughed, whispered. How can the wisest man in Athens be married to the worst woman in Greece? What they didn't know was that Socrates didn't merely tolerate Xanthippe. He chose her. He welcomed her fury, her chaos, her wild unpredictability. He once said, "I married her because I wanted to learn patience." A simple answer, but one hiding a complex truth. Socrates, the master of inner freedom, understood something most men don't. The destruction of a great man does not begin with war or politics. It begins in the home, in the heart, with the person closest to him. But here's the real question. Did Socrates marry a monster, or did he marry a mirror, one that revealed the darker truths of his own mind? This isn't just a story about a bad marriage. It's a doorway into a deeper psychological pattern, one that echoes throughout history. Why do great men often attract, or are attracted to, the very forces that eventually destroy them? Not just women, but archetypes, forces, psychological energies wrapped in beauty, chaos, power, and emotional intensity. Why does the lion sleep beside the snake? Why do the kings fall to whispers from the queen? Why do genius and madness shake hands so often? This is a story of Socrates, but it's also a story of the kind of woman, or rather, the kind of force, that destroys great men, and it all begins with a scream. Welcome to the labyrinth. Let's walk in. To the common eye, Xanthippe was a mistake. Loud, confrontational, sharp-tongued, and emotionally volcanic. Everything the logical mind of a philosopher might seek to avoid. Yet Socrates, the embodiment of reason, married her, and not by accident or obligation, by choice. When asked why he chose such a difficult woman, Socrates replied simply, "She is good for me. She teaches me patience." To many, this sounded like sarcasm. To others, the dry humor of a stoic. But what if it wasn't a joke? What if it was a key, a subtle clue into a deeper worldview? Socrates didn't seek peace in life. He sought truth, and truth, as he knew, rarely comes gently. Xanthippe was not a footnote in his life. She was a living paradox, a symbol of the very chaos he spent his life dissecting. In her storm, he found something to study, something to resist, something to sharpen himself against, just as a blade must be struck against stone to find its edge. Perhaps Socrates saw her as the stone. In ancient Greece, the archetype of the feminine was rarely soft or passive. It was Pandora, whose curiosity unleashed all the world's suffering. Medea, who betrayed her father and murdered her children. The sirens, who sang beautiful songs that lured men to their deaths. The feminine was not weak. It was powerful, enchanting, and profoundly dangerous. And this was not misogyny. This was myth, a symbolic truth, a reflection of something deeper than gender, the dynamic between order and chaos, reason and instinct, control and surrender. In Jungian psychology, this duality is universal. The masculine principle, logos, represents structure, clarity, rationality. The feminine, eros, embodies emotion, change, nature, and the unpredictable. When balanced, they create harmony. When at war, they create destruction or transformation. Socrates, deeply rational, knew the danger of isolation in thought. Philosophy, if locked in books and lectures, becomes stale, disconnected from life. But when tested against chaos, it either crumbles or crystallizes. Socrates didn't just want to think about truth. He wanted to live in the fire of it, to walk daily through contradiction, conflict, and temptation, not to escape it, but to master it. Xanthippe was not his burden. She was his trial. And it's important to recognize that Socrates didn't respond with anger. He never fought fire with fire. He responded with stillness, patience, a slow, methodical dismantling of the emotional outburst, through silence, through calm, through the strength of an unshaken mind. To many, this looks like endurance. But to a philosopher, it's something more: transformation, an alchemical process where noise is turned into wisdom, where conflict is turned into clarity. Socrates was training his soul, and she was his sparring partner. But why does this matter today? Because this dynamic, the attraction of rational men to chaotic women, is not ancient history. It's alive. It plays out in bedrooms, boardrooms, texts left unread, and public breakdowns. It's the same dance of psychological forces: reason drawn to emotion, clarity pulled toward mystery, logic seduced by fire. And often, the modern man, like the ancient one, doesn't understand what he's entering into. He thinks he's choosing love, but he's choosing chaos. He thinks he's saving her, but he's being devoured. He thinks he's strong until he realizes that strength, without awareness, is just ego in disguise. Socrates understood this. He didn't try to change Xanthippe. He didn't play the victim. He observed. He studied. He used every scream, every insult, every dish thrown across the room as a lesson in detachment, resilience, and psychological insight. What does it take to sit in the storm and remain unmoved? To be surrounded by chaos and not become chaotic? That was the test. And Socrates, the man who never wrote a single book, left behind a legacy not of words, but of how he lived in a world obsessed with comfort, with pleasure, with ease. His choice looks strange, but perhaps that's because modern man has forgotten that greatness doesn't grow in safety. It grows in struggle, in paradox, in facing the very thing that most people spend their lives avoiding. Xanthippe was not a mistake. She was a mirror, and through that mirror, Socrates came to know himself, to confront chaos without being consumed by it. That was the philosopher's path, and it began at home. With her, throughout myth, literature, and history, there are women who do not simply love, they consume. They do not destroy with violence. but with allure, with brilliance, with a force that doesn't knock down the door, but invites the man to open it himself, step through, and vanish. These are not just characters. They are archetypes, timeless psychological blueprints embedded in the human mind, and they speak to something far deeper than gender. They represent forces within all of us. As Carl Jung taught, archetypes are not people. They are patterns, and among the most dangerous of these patterns is the destructive feminine. This is not about blaming women. It's not about morality. It's about energy, symbolism, and the psychological reality that what destroys a man is often not what's opposed to him, but what completes him in all the wrong ways. Let's start with the siren, the woman whose beauty, voice, or presence seduces men to their doom. In Homer's Odyssey, the sirens sing so sweetly that men jump from ships and drown just to reach them. Odysseus ties himself to the mast to resist their call. He knows it's a trap, and still, he wants to hear it. That's the point. These archetypes don't drag men to their doom. They call to something inside the man that wants to be ruined. Helen of Troy. Her face launched 1,000 ships, but she didn't ask for war. Men chose war for her. They projected onto her the ideal of beauty, of value, of meaning. She didn't wield the sword. She inspired it. And that's the core of this archetype. Projection. In Jungian psychology, every man carries within him an inner feminine, the Anima. She represents feeling, intuition, mystery, desire. When a man doesn't integrate his Anima, he projects her outward onto a woman who becomes, in his eyes, a goddess, a muse, a savior. But no human can carry the weight of a man's unlived inner life. And when she fails to live up to the fantasy, or worse, uses it to her advantage, the man crumbles. Nietzsche feared this deeply. He spoke of how the will to power can disguise itself, how beauty can become a mask for domination, not overt, but psychological. The kind of control where the man doesn't feel imprisoned because he's too busy worshipping the chains. Take Cleopatra. Brilliant, charismatic, politically cunning. Caesar and Mark Antony both fell for her. Not by accident, but by awe. They didn't just love her. They surrendered to her. She became the axis of their decision-making, their identity, their downfall. Her power was not brute force. It was enchantment. And in every era, we see versions of her. The Black Widow, seductive, mysterious, emotionally consuming. She may not seek destruction, but her very intensity pulls the man into a world where his own edges begin to blur. He becomes lost in her, and in doing so, loses himself. But here's what's often missed. These archetypes don't exist without the man's participation. She is a mirror, reflecting his shadow, his wounds, his hunger for intensity. Robert Moore, a Jungian analyst, spoke of the devouring feminine, not as a person, but as an archetypal field, a zone of psychological gravity that pulls men in when they lack inner structure. When they haven't faced their own darkness, they are drawn to hers. And often, the man most at risk is not the brute, but the seeker, the artist, the philosopher, the man who craves something more, Because here's the twist. Destructive women don't seduce weak men. They seduce powerful men. Men with vision, ambition, complexity, but who carry unintegrated shadows, wounds they haven't examined, chaos they haven't made peace with. She enters. She reflects their fire, and soon he's addicted. It begins with admiration, evolves into dependence, and ends in psychological collapse. Consider Lady Macbeth, a woman who doesn't kill, but unleashes. She speaks to the hidden ambition in Macbeth. She doesn't force him to act. She activates him. She becomes the voice of his shadow, and once that door is opened, he walks through willingly. In modern psychology, this shows up in narcissistic relationships. The woman who lives off attention, adoration, emotional dominance, the man, often sensitive and idealistic, becomes the giver, the fixer. He erases himself to keep her happy, and the more he gives, the more she needs. He thinks he's saving her, but he's feeding her and starving himself. Eventually, he wakes up hollowed out, angry, confused, because he doesn't understand. She was never the villain. She was the mirror, the chaos he refused to own inside himself. So what's the lesson? It's not to avoid women, or emotion, or passion. It's to understand archetypes, to see beyond the face and into the pattern, because every destructive feminine archetype reveals a masculine wound, unhealed, ignored, or romanticized. The siren calls when the man hasn't found his purpose. The black widow thrives when the man abandons his boundaries. The narcissist feeds when the man believes love requires sacrifice of self. Socrates knew this. He didn't run from chaos. He faced it. He used it. Because he had something most modern. Men don't. Inner clarity. A mind that observed. A soul that questioned. An identity not based on validation, but on truth. The woman that destroys a man is rarely evil. She is energy. She is myth. She is the unanswered question in the man's heart. And until he faces that question, he will always find her, again and again, not to blame her, but to finally see himself. History remembers the conquests, the symphonies, the inventions, the brilliance of men who bent the world to their vision. But behind many of these triumphs is another, darker pattern, a hidden fracture, a woman, a relationship, a downfall that wasn't political or military, but emotional, psychological, intimate. Great men do not always fall from bullets or betrayals. Sometimes they fall from love. The question is, why? Why do those with unshakable will, immense intellect, and world-shaping power often find themselves lost in personal chaos? The answer isn't obvious, but it is deep, and it lives at the intersection of greatness and shadow. To begin, we must understand the psyche of the great man. He is not average. He is not balanced. He is, by design, obsessive, singular, a visionary, consumed by purpose. He sacrifices comfort for ambition, stability for impact. This very intensity is what allows him to build empires, write masterpieces, or lead revolutions. But obsession comes with a cost. To excel in one domain often means to neglect others. the man who dominates, the world may be a stranger to his own emotional life. The more he ascends intellectually or socially, the more disconnected he can become from vulnerability, connection, and himself. Take Napoleon Bonaparte, a genius of military strategy, a force of political revolution, and yet completely ensnared by his love for Josephine. Her infidelity broke him. His letters to her are not the writings of a god of war. They are the cries of a wounded child, pleading, desperate. He could conquer Europe, but not her heart. Why? Because Napoleon, like many great men, carried within him a profound emotional hunger, one that success could not feed. And in that hunger, Josephine became more than a lover. She became a symbol of love, of beauty, of validation. He didn't just love her. He needed her to complete the part of him he had sacrificed in pursuit of power. This is the essence of the hero complex. A man builds an identity around saving others, achieving greatness, fulfilling destiny. But when he turns that heroic energy toward relationships, it often becomes distorted. He doesn't relate, he rescues. He doesn't connect, he projects. And the woman becomes either a muse or a monster. The deeper truth is this: greatness often emerges from trauma. The early wound, the absent father, the cold mother, the isolation that taught the child to survive by overachieving. Many great men aren't driven by peace, but by pain. And in adulthood, that pain doesn't disappear. It transforms. It seeks resolution, not through therapy, but through intensity, through relationships that recreate the original wound, with the hope of finally healing it. This is the trap of trauma bonding, the addictive cycle of pain and pleasure that masquerades as love. The highs are euphoric, the lows are devastating, and the man, especially one unfamiliar with emotional health, confuses chaos with depth. He believes drama is passion, that jealousy is proof of love, that emotional volatility means significance. But it doesn't. It means he's been caught in a pattern older than his achievements. Pablo Picasso was one of the greatest artists in history, but behind the genius was a man consumed by the women in his life. His relationship with Dora Maar was not a partnership. It was a psychological battlefield. She was brilliant, complex, emotionally intense. He fed off her suffering, even encouraged it for the sake of his art, and she broke. Picasso once said, "For me, there are only two kinds of women, goddesses and doormats." That wasn't poetry. It was pathology. The inability to see a woman as a whole human being, only as a reflection of his own inner dichotomy. It reveals another psychological concept: anxious, avoidant attachment. The anxious partner craves closeness, constantly fears abandonment. The avoidant partner fears intimacy, withdraws when things get emotional. Together, they form a dance, chasing and running, loving and wounding, over and over again. Often, the great man is the avoidant, emotionally armored, distant. He fears vulnerability, not because he's cold, but because it feels dangerous. His lover, sensing the distance, becomes more anxious, more demanding, and the more she chases, the more he withdraws, until both are drowning. The relationship becomes a war, but not of hatred, of unmet needs. And when it ends, the man is often left shattered, not because of the woman, but because the mirror she held up to him finally cracked. Ted Hughes, the great English poet, lived this tragedy. His marriage to Sylvia Plath, a genius in her own right, was a storm of brilliance and agony. She was tormented, volatile, deeply sensitive. He was stoic, driven, emotionally distant. Together, they created poetry and destruction. Her suicide haunted him for the rest of his life, and the world asked, was it love, or was it psychological collision? The truth is, both, because here's what intelligence never guarantees: emotional clarity. A man can master philosophy, lead nations, solve equations that explain the cosmos, and still be utterly blind to his own heart. His IQ does not protect him from projection. His success does not shield him from addiction, to intensity, to suffering, to the illusion of love. In fact, sometimes his very greatness is what makes him vulnerable, because the higher a man climbs, the lonelier it gets. The fewer people he can trust, the more disconnected he becomes from the ordinary, grounding experiences of life. And into that void steps a woman, passionate, unpredictable, intoxicating. She feels like truth, like salvation, like the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. But often, she's not an answer. She's an echo of everything he ran from, now dressed as love. So what can be done? It begins with integration, with facing the emotional self that was exiled in the name of success, with learning the language of feelings, not just ideas, with understanding that greatness is not just achievement, it is wholeness, and most of all, with seeing others, especially women, not as symbols, but as souls. The woman that destroys the great man isn't a witch, a villain, or a curse. She is often just human, wounded, complex, real. The destruction comes not from her nature, but from the illusion the man placed on her. Because when a man refuses to look inward, life sends him mirrors, and sometimes those mirrors break him, so that he might finally see himself. In the end, the downfall of great men is rarely a mystery. It's psychology, projection, repetition, and the longing to feel whole through someone else. But true power begins when a man stops looking for salvation in chaos and starts finding peace in his own shadow. This story was never about women. That's the first illusion we must shatter. It is not about blame, nor about gender. It is about forces, psychological, archetypal, elemental. The feminine, in myth, in dream, in the deepest corners of the human psyche, is not simply a woman. It is a current, a pulse in the human experience that is as old as fire and as mysterious as the ocean. To understand what Socrates truly saw in Xanthippe, we must leave behind the smallness of gossip and enter the realm of symbols. Socrates was not just enduring a difficult wife. He was engaging with the feminine in its rawest form, unpredictable, emotional, volcanic, and not to defeat it, but to learn from it. To the modern ear, this sounds strange, but the ancient world thought in symbols, not headlines. They understood that every person who enters your life is also a mirror, and sometimes that mirror reflects your own chaos back to you. Xanthippe was that mirror. She wasn't just a quarrelsome spouse. She was a manifestation of chaos, the very energy that disturbs order, that breaks routine, that forces a reckoning. The Greeks told this story many times. Pandora, the first woman in myth, opened the jar that unleashed all sorrows upon mankind. Medea destroyed Jason's legacy in the name of betrayal. The sirens sang beautiful songs to drown men at sea. Always, the pattern is the same: beauty, power, danger. But none of these figures were evil in the way we moderns understand the E word. They were forces. Unstable, yes, but necessary. Because in the old world, it was understood there can be no growth without tension, no strength without pressure, no wisdom without pain. This is the philosophical root of what Carl Jung would later describe as the dynamic between the masculine and feminine in every human psyche. The masculine is not man. It is structure, focus, clarity, purpose. It is the line that cuts through the formless. The feminine is not woman. It is emotion, nature, flow, instinct. It is the river that carves mountains over time. One without the other becomes dysfunctional. Structure without feeling becomes tyranny. Emotion without direction becomes destruction. But together, they generate life in individuals, in relationships, in civilizations. This polarity isn't just romantic, it's spiritual. When Socrates said Xanthippe taught him patience, he wasn't being ironic. He was revealing a metaphysical truth. Chaos is the teacher of the wise. The fool runs from it. The tyrant tries to crush it. But the philosopher, he listens. He studies. He transforms. Xanthippe was his crucible, his philosopher's stone, not a woman to be defeated, but a force to be understood. Through her fire, he refined his soul, because the feminine, in its shadow form, does not care for your titles, your logic, or your authority. It dissolves what is false. It exposes what is repressed. It calls forth the storm, not to destroy you, but to reveal what in you cannot survive the storm. This is what the myth of the dragon has always meant. The hero confronts a beast, massive, terrifying, chaotic. Sometimes that dragon guards gold. Other times, it guards a woman. But symbolically, the dragon is always the same thing, the chaos that must be integrated. And sometimes, that chaos wears perfume. It smiles, it seduces, it questions your worth, not with cruelty, but with intensity. She is not the enemy. She is the gatekeeper. You don't conquer her by domination. You don't flee from her by withdrawal. You become worthy of her by growing into the man who can stand in her storm without being shattered. In this sense, the feminine is not the obstacle. It is the threshold. Modern culture misunderstands this. It either demonizes the feminine, labeling it manipulative, unstable, toxic, or it idealizes it as soft, nurturing, divine. But both are distortions. The true feminine is power. When balanced, it inspires, heals, gives birth to civilizations. When unbalanced, it devours, manipulates, confuses. but always it demands growth. The man who fears this energy, who resents its unpredictability, who suppresses it or tries to control it, is ultimately consumed by it. He becomes rigid, bitter, disconnected from life. His relationships turn to control or avoidance. His vision becomes sterile. But the man who confronts the feminine in his relationships, in his psyche, in the world, awakens something deeper. He becomes whole, not through conquest, but through integration. This is what Socrates understood. He did not marry a goddess. He married a mirror, and through her chaos, he became a clearer man. The lesson is not about picking the right woman. It is about meeting the right force with the right consciousness. Whether that force arrives as a lover, a challenge, or an inner emotion, the question is not how to avoid her. The question is, are you ready to face her? Because the feminine is not here to validate you. She is here to test you. And if you are not grounded in purpose, you will fall. If you are not anchored in self-knowledge, you will drown. But if you are present, truly present, then chaos becomes your ally. She no longer threatens your ego. She sharpens your spirit. This is the secret most never understand. The dragon is not outside of you. She lives in the part of you you refuse to feel. And the only way forward is not through control, but through courage. The courage to listen, to feel, to change, and to love not what is safe, but what is true. We like to think the modern world is new, that we've outgrown the mythologies of old, that we've moved beyond dragons and sirens, heroes and temptresses. But beneath the surface of every dating app, behind the language of empowerment and therapy, the same ancient energies are still at play, just wearing digital masks. Today, the battlefield isn't Troy, it's Tinder, and the drama isn't written in Homeric verse. It's encrypted in text messages, Instagram stories, and ghosted conversations. But the underlying dynamic? It hasn't changed. Masculine and feminine, order and chaos, eros and destruction. These aren't outdated ideas. They're psychological forces playing out in real time, in real relationships. The myth has gone viral. We now live in a world where gender roles are fragmented, where men are told they must be soft and strong at once, and women are told they must be everything: a boss, a goddess, a lover, and completely self-sufficient. The result? Confusion, disconnection, masked chaos. Let's start with the obvious: the rise of hyper-feminine narcissism on social media, a curated avatar culture where validation becomes currency, where beauty is filtered and attention is monetized. The algorithm rewards allure, not depth, and in that echo chamber, something changes. Not just how women see themselves, but how men are conditioned to see them. It's not just sexualization, it's the crafting of personas designed to seduce not individuals, but masses. In a world where everyone is performative, authenticity becomes an anomaly, and the more virtual the interaction, the less anchored it becomes in truth. Enter the manosphere, the reaction, the backlash. Some men, disillusioned and enraged, retreat into online tribes where feminine chaos is analyzed like a predator's pattern. Words like hypergamy, female nature, a walt, fill forums like battle cries. But underneath the rage is something quieter, something sadder, a profound sense of disempowerment. These men are not all misogynists. Many are simply lost, confused by the cultural double-binds, expected to be leaders without permission to lead, expected to be stoic yet emotionally available, assertive but never dominant. And when they fail to reconcile the contradictions, they either collapse or rebel, and rebellion often becomes caricature, the alpha posturing, the cold detachment, the obsession with status as revenge. But even this is rooted in a very old wound. The man rejected by the feminine and made to feel invisible. In a mythic sense, he is no different than Achilles without honor or Hamlet without Ophelia. So, where do we go from here? Therapy culture tells us to self-soothe, to name our traumas, to heal. But something gets lost in this language, us infinite introspection. We forget that pain is not just to be analyzed, it is to be transformed. We forget that relationships are not just emotional support systems, they are arenas for initiation. And in a society obsessed with comfort, we often mistake challenge for toxicity. But maybe some chaos is sacred. Maybe the modern woman, empowered, self-possessed, fierce, is not the problem. Maybe she is the new face of the dragon, the same test in a new form. And maybe the modern man, overwhelmed, passive, uncertain, isn't weak. Maybe he's just been denied the map, because without mythology, without initiation, he is left to interpret feminine power as either a threat to be conquered or a storm to be avoided. He doesn't see it as what it actually is, the forge in which his own power is tested. Is it any surprise that men are retreating? That male loneliness is at an all-time high? That pornography, escapism, and virtual relationships are replacing real intimacy? When men no longer see a purpose in chaos, they numb themselves to it. But here's the deeper question. Is the destruction of the great man always a tragedy, or is it part of his evolution? Nietzsche once wrote, "You must still have chaos in yourself to give birth to a dancing star." What he meant was that greatness isn't born from comfort. It is born from the confrontation with the unknown, with the feminine, not the woman, the force. In myth, the hero always dies before he is reborn, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally, but death is required, the shattering of who he thought he was, the stripping away of ego, illusion, and control. Only then does he emerge, not as a boy pretending to be a man, but as a man who knows who he is. In today's terms, that death looks different. It might look like a heartbreak that cracks his identity, a betrayal that awakens his awareness, a relationship that becomes a spiritual fire he cannot escape. And yes, sometimes that fire comes from a woman who seems chaotic, manipulative, or even cruel. But maybe she's not the villain. Maybe she's the mirror, the reflection of all the unconscious parts of himself he refuses to face, the parts he represses to stay in control, the parts he avoids so he can keep his mask intact. Because real masculinity isn't the absence of emotion, it's the capacity to hold it, to stay present in the face of intensity, to lead not by domination, but by integrity. And real femininity isn't passive. It's powerful, it disrupts, it provokes, it awakens, and when unconscious, it devours. So here we are, a culture of disoriented men and disillusioned women, searching, blaming, ghosting, posting. But underneath all the noise is something eternal. The man who grows only in safety is not growing. The woman who fears her own chaos becomes manipulative. The polarity collapses, and both become half versions of themselves. But when a man meets a woman, not with fear or resentment, but with awareness, something ancient is reborn. Not patriarchy, not submission, but alchemy. The masculine as the spine, the feminine as the storm, the dance that builds not empires, but souls. This is the myth behind the mask, the story playing out in texts, hookups, therapy sessions, and lonely scrolls at midnight. And until we learn to see beyond the personas, we will keep playing the same roles, just on a shinier stage. Modern men, modern women, same gods, same battles, new costumes, but the hero's journey remains, always, waiting for the man who is no longer afraid to die, so that he may finally come alive. Socrates did not die in a war. He did not die with a sword in his hand or a crown on his head. He died quietly in a prison cell, surrounded by students and a cup of poison. To many, it looked like defeat, but it wasn't. It was his final lesson. Throughout his life, Socrates never claimed to know much. He wandered the streets of Athens, questioning everyone, from politicians to poets, not to destroy them, but to strip away illusions. His mission wasn't conquest, it was clarity. But what's often overlooked is that Socrates did not only do philosophy in the streets, he did it at home too, in silence, in struggle, in chaos. Her name was Xanthippe. She was fiery, unpredictable, emotional, everything he wasn't. People mocked him for staying married to her. They wondered why a man of such calm wisdom would tolerate such disorder in his private life. But Socrates wasn't tolerating it. He was studying it. He once said, "She is good for me. She teaches me patience." Most take this as sarcasm. But what if it wasn't? What if it was the clearest expression of his philosophy? What if Socrates, in all his wisdom, understood something few men today are willing to accept? That chaos is not your enemy. It is your training ground. That the yelling, the storm, the unpredictability of the feminine wasn't a mistake in his life. It was the forge in which his spirit was shaped. Because the real test of a man is never found in moments of peace. It's found in his response to disorder, not in whether he can dominate it, suppress it, or escape it, but whether he can remain rooted in truth while standing inside the hurricane. Socrates could debate anyone, but at home, with Xanthippe, the debate was silent, internal, the kind that wears down your ego, not your opponent. And that's the battle most men lose today. We live in a culture that teaches avoidance, ghost her, block her, escape her, or worse, blame her. But Socrates knew the truth. The enemy is never outside you, not even when she's yelling, not even when she's irrational, not even when she's tearing down everything you've built. The real enemy is your own inability to remain sovereign amidst it, not emotionally dead, not disconnected, but unshakable, rooted, fully alive, and yet fully undisturbed. This is why Socrates chose death with dignity, because the stakes were the same: order or chaos, truth or comfort, integrity or surrender. He drank the hemlock not because he had no options, but because his life had always been a refusal to compromise truth, no matter the cost. And that's what made him untouchable. You see, the woman who destroys great men isn't always a person. Sometimes she is a force, a test, a mirror. Sometimes she is life itself, dressed in allure, wielding chaos, asking, are you still a man when everything collapses? Are you still rooted when the storm kisses your ego and calls it love? Can you hold your truth even when it hurts? Socrates passed that test, not because he was perfect, but because he didn't flinch. He understood that pain is part of purification, that comfort is not the goal, that greatness isn't found in the absence of the storm, but in the eye of it. So when we look at the stories of men destroyed by love, by beauty, by betrayal, Napoleon, Picasso, Hughes, we have to ask, were they destroyed by women, or were they revealed by them? Did the feminine kill them, or did it expose what they never learned to master? The final lesson, the one Socrates left us with, is simple but devastating. You are not tested by the world. You are revealed by it. And the one who brings that revelation often comes in the form of a woman who does not yield, who does not soothe, who does not bow to your expectations. She may look like an enemy, but she is not. She is the moment before transformation, the final gate, the dragon at the end of the cave. And whether she destroys you or awakens you, that choice was always yours.